Good afternoon, everyone.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Siamo qui in Sala delle Colonne di Ca' Giustinian, sede della Biennale di Venezia, per ospitare una delle sessioni del programma allargato, i Meetings on Architecture della 17ª Biennale di Architettura 2021. Grazie per essere qui di persona e anche a chi ci ascolta online. Ci sono circa 100 persone online e qui ci sono 70 persone più o meno. Benvenuti a tutti da tutto il mondo. Brevemente, questo incontro riguarda un film messo insieme da un gruppo che si chiama Sensory Ethnography Lab all'Università di Harvard, Verena Paravella e Lucien Castin, entrambi etnografi e cineasti. Parla di rapporto tra cinematografia e estetica e ha ripensato il formato di un documentario. Ci sono stati riconoscimenti internazionali importanti su questo film, ha già ricevuto dei riconoscimenti importanti a Berlino, tra l'altro. È già stato mostrato anche a musei come il MoMA di New York. Il film che hanno messo insieme questi artisti sono interviste, molto interessanti, sono delle interviste con un formato davvero particolare, la loro dimensione visiva è sempre sorprendente. Come vivremo insieme? How will we live together? Senza soltanto le facce e le voci. Fin dall'inizio abbiamo chiarito che gli intervistati non dovessero essere architetti, ma persone che potessero riflettere sul come vivremo insieme. Il risultato sono queste interviste orchestrate in modo magistrale dai registi, che permettono l'emergere di un dialogo senza che le persone che parlano si parlino tra loro. Il film è di circa 2 ore, è proiettato ai giardini, è diviso in 3 sezioni. La sezione che vedremo oggi, questo pomeriggio, è la terza sezione. La prima parte si concentra sull'affrontare la questione se mai vivremo insieme, quindi una domanda di tipo esistenziale. La seconda parte del film riguarda una visione più programmatica del come vivremo insieme, con una proiezione verso il futuro. La terza sezione si concentra sulla comprensione biologica di chi siamo, includendo altre specie e esseri viventi. Questa è la terza sezione del film che vedremo oggi. Sono circa 90 minuti. Le persone che parlano in questa sezione particolare cominciano con il nostro ospite Emanuele Coccia, che non serve presentare per il pubblico italiano, ma serve presentare al pubblico internazionale. È un professore di scienze sociali a Parigi, un filosofo. Ha lavorato molto sull'espansione del ruolo della filosofia da un punto di vista non antropogenico, e il suo libro The Life of Plants ha scosso le radici del pensiero, e un suo nuovo libro è The Philosophy of the House. C'è una sovrapposizione quindi tra il suo lavoro e l'argomento di questa biennale. Sono grato ad Emanuele, che ci raggiungerà su Zoom per una discussione alla fine dopo il film. Tra gli intervistati Bruno Lacour, un filosofo antropologo, professore a Parigi, il cui lavoro ha trasformato il pensiero sulla società e sull'azione. We have never been ordered, che si fa domande sull'esistenza. In questa serie fa quasi da ponte tra la sessione precedente e questa. Poi Susan Goldor, una biologa, micologa, presidente del Club Micologico di Boston, Il suo lavoro si concentra sul comportamento, sulla pesca e si svolge in tutto il mondo, dall'Anatolia all'Alaska. Olivia Jetson, una biologa anche lei, giornalista che ha scritto ampiamente sui giornali come il New York Times e settimanali come l'Economist e il National Geographer. Si concentra sulla vita degli animali e tra i suoi scritti c'è un libro, Dr. Tatiana Sex Advice to All Creatures, con discussione sulla sessualità degli animali. Xian Trexpin, un filosofo belga che ha affrontato un settore chiamato Animal Studies, studi sugli animali. How to Live with Animals è uno dei suoi libri che sono diventati un classico. E poi Violaine Luchou, un artista, un sound performing artist, un artista del suono, che vedremo alla fine di queste interviste, che ha catalogato musica sperimentale, versi degli animali. E il suo lavoro è stato eseguito in tanti siti importanti nel mondo. Siamo fortunati ad averlo in questo film. Mi fermo qui, lascio partire il film e tornerò poi qui sul palco per una discussione con Emanuele Coccia e per le domande del pubblico. Ci vediamo dopo.
So if the question is, will we be able to live together, which is another version of the question, we need to answer first another one, which is what is the we consider. If the we is humans among themselves, it's a very traditional question of political philosophy. And the answer is how to keep order, so to speak, in society, or justice. But we don't consider a vast extension of a we who are participants in the question of living together. Now, if we hear living together in ecological terms, and if we consider only humans, the question is, can humans live together? The answer is no, of course, because humans isolated from other living forms disappear as quickly as possible. We need bacteria, we need trees, clouds, waters, so there's nothing like a human-centered question of living together. Now, so far, the track record of this question, can we live together and will we be able to live together, is not very good, because modernization has been made almost entirely around the question of social order, and the scream, which can be a summary of the 20th century, is get lost, all of the others. I mean, just we don't need to consider you. So the answer is no, we don't want to live with you. You being, for instance, bacteria, we use antibiotics to destroy you. We don't want to live with you, tigers and elephants and etc. We don't want to live with you, forests, etc. So I guess that there is behind this question, if it's raised by architects, a sort of feeling of culpability, let's say, for not having raised this question earlier, so to speak, and where the question of living together is more important than building things. So this is probably the reason why they have introduced this question for the Biennale, because Le Corbusier will not have this question of living together. He would have asked, where do we build and how many other entities can we expulse or exclude, so to speak. So it is a well-meaning question, which entirely depends on the span of entities which have to be taken into account, because if we say it's just human, it's just cities, it's just industry, we have one set of answers. If we say no, it's also all of the conditions that allow those cities and people to behave and be sustained, it's a different one. So I will turn around the question and add another one before, which in my view is more interesting, which is how many entities do we take into account first? So political task is double. First, settle the question of how many do we take into account, and then only the question of can we live together can be actually sort of articulated. Then if we ask the first question, there are two questions inside this first question. The one is how many entities coming around have to be heard? It can be poor people, or it can be foreign land, or it can be bacteria or animals and trees and poisons and so on. So there's a question of the hearing mechanism by which you let new entities enter into the question of the we. And then, still in the first question, how many are we? There is another task, which is to inquire on the bona fide right, so to speak, of those entities to be taken into the we. Because we cannot take, no community, no architect, no polity can take into account everything. But we need to have a system by which, when there are new entities coming in and knocking at the door and say we want to be part of a we, they need to be sort of inquired about and sort of articulated and entered. And this is the task of scientists, citizens, and politicians, and so on, to let them have a say, so to speak. Because in my view, scientists are the ones who are doing this job of hearing about new entities and making them enter properly the collective who is asking this question of can we live together. Once this task is settled, the task of listening to new voices and inquiring about their state, so to speak, their standing. It can be a river, or it can be clouds, it can be climate, it can be anything. Then the question of can we live together can be raised. And this question itself has two tasks, so to speak. One of them is, okay, you want to live with me, you want to live with me, this we don't want to live with you, this we want to live with. Task of hierarchy. That is giving orders of importance to all those entities we have accepted in the first task, okay? And that's a very difficult and tricky question, which is, do you prefer to have plastic bags and polluted seas, or do you want to have clean seas, but then you don't want that? All of these orders is what is in question in every decision, technical decision, and architects, of course, are very aware of that. But that's a really different task from the two others I described before. And then, once we have a hierarchy, we have to have a decision. Yes, we want to live with votes and not with votes. And here, it's a clearly legal and political decision which has to be made, which is to say, okay, now that we have accepted these entities into the common life, so to speak, this is decided. We now have said that we don't want plastic bags, for example, to take this example. It's a bit silly, but it's a nice example. Or we want to have buildings which have to be completely composed of local resources or something like that. And then it's the institution part. It's a decision. So asking in general the question, can we live together without making these differences between those four different tasks is a bit empty, because it feels good to say, yes, we will live together, but it's completely mistaken, because first, there are lots of things. I mean, I had bed bugs for 1 week. I had bed bugs in my house in Paris, and I can tell you I don't want to live with this. And I was ready to do absolutely everything to get rid of them. So living together is an empty term coming from the harmonious idea of nature that the deep ecologists have imagined. It's a good question if you say, okay, there are 4 different tasks, 2 big questions, how many are we and can we live together? But the first task itself is made of 2 tasks, listening to the new entities and inquiring about them. And the second task is to make a hierarchy, that's the hardest one actually. And the 4th one is to say, okay, now we have decided, we keep going. Of course, there is a little trick here, is that once you have decided to live with those entities against those entities, you are probably mistaken. And hell is paved with good intention. So you need a way to revise these political procedures. Because as soon as you have decided that it's very good, for example, to green cities, this is a very interesting question of architecture, then you have people who say it's completely ridiculous to make trees in cities. What you need is to white cities. And it's much more efficient in terms of energy, albedo, and so on. So immediately you have a dispute once you have instituted a form of life. So you need a revision of a system by which those 4 different tasks has to be combined.
I think that we cannot imagine anymore to live without thinking about living with animals. Virus, for example, is a very good example of what happens to us. And we discovered last year with the first quarantine that birds were living with us and we didn't even imagine that they were there. But a lot of people heard them singing and it was really joyful, the first quarantine. No, the second quarantine, they pretty more muted by all the noise we have around. So if I think about how will we live with all these animals, and I want us to think about that, I think that the first thing that we should, and that this pandemic has taught us, is that we will live in thinking very seriously about distances. Which means that if this virus could make so much fun among us, is probably because, and mostly because, we don't know anything about distances anymore. Which means that we're not sure about the pangolin hypothesis, but we're not sure about the bat hypothesis, about the bats. But we have to think that if the bats could contaminate humans, it's because they met each other where they shouldn't have met. Because bats do not wish to live with humans. They live in cavern and in the country. Which means that if bats came into contact with humans, we have multiple hypotheses about that. It's first because their own territory were completely stole from them, and that they probably did not have habitat anymore, which means that they are obliged, they ought to live with us. And some of the people who thought about that also made the hypothesis that if the bats came so much around the humans and so close to the humans being, it might be because of the waves, of the 5G waves that completely disturb them, and finally they don't find the route, they don't find the ways anymore, they don't know where they are anymore, and so they are coming too close from human people. And I think that is the signals that something is going really wrong in that world, that we have to live with other beings, but we consider, and I think that's not all humans, but some of us, and unfortunately the most powerful among us, are really thinking like if we were home everywhere, which means that having the feeling of being home everywhere means that your territory is completely overlapping other territories, and that animals do not have any places to live. And most of animals today are not only going to be extinct because of hunting, because of starving, because of a lot of things, but also because they do not have any spaces anymore to live.
The existence of plants on Earth modified radically the Earth because of the photosynthesis, or because of the fact that they are, in a way, first of all, responsible for the presence of the oxygen on the atmosphere, but also because of the fact, and above all, because of the fact that they are the only living beings, or of these sites, in a way, that are able to catch the sun energy, the solar energy, and to in a way to put it within matter, so, and to make it available for other living beings. Which means there is a very, very beautiful, in a way, fact, the fact that actually all our life is depending on the sun energy or the sunlight. So every time that everybody is eating, every animal is eating, actually we are searching, or we are looking for this light, and what we call food, or what we call nutrition, is this actually this kind of very secret trade of sunlight, which is going from body to another body, to a species from another species, and from a kingdom to a kingdom. So the life on Earth is, in a way, the life of the sunlight, which animates the mineral body of Gaia, so in a way. But besides of that, actually, so the plants are, in a way, capturing and catching this light, and they redesign totally the planet, which means that, so Gaia, or the Earth, is actually a garden, but a garden where the plants are not just the content or the species to be seen, but the gardeners themselves. So and we could speak about that also for every living being. So every living being is a gardener, so a landscape architect, and every piece of the Earth is not the natural ecosystem, is actually a garden or a landscape produced by a lot of gardeners, a lot of living species. Or we could say even, perhaps we could go even further and say that actually we should, starting, for instance, to consider living species or ecosystems as sort of biennial, so multi-specific biennial, in the sense that let's take, for instance, let's start from because it could be too abstract. Let's start from a very stupid example. So you are just strolling around on the country, so, and you're seeing a lot of flowers. So those flowers are pollinized normally by bees or by insects. And what is interesting is the fact that, so from this point of view, flowers are structures which allow plants to put their own genetical and biological destiny in the hands of other species, in the hands of individuals who are belonging to other kingdoms. So in a way, that means, for instance, that flowers put actually insects in the same position of what we call geneticians or breeders, and that means, for instance, that in nature there is always genetical modification, artificial genetical modification from a species to a species. So every living species is also the agriculture of other species, or every living species is in a way has relationship of husbandry toward other species. So agricultural husbandry are not just human business. But what is interesting in the example of bees and flowers is the fact that this genetical activity of modifying the biological destiny of other species is not based on rational calculus, because a bee is actually visiting a flower or another flower, so it's deciding who is mating with whom, just on the base of sugar, so just on the base of taste, actually. So, but that means that if it's true, and it's true, that we have to consider the evolution as a sort of artistic curatorial activities, because the evolution of the plants is based on choices based on taste, which is art, which is fashion. So in a way, we have to consider, or that means that the natural spaces are actually on much, in a way, on a longer time, as the same structure as a museum. And we have to consider ecosystems as this kind of contemporary natural expositions, or contemporary nature biennial, where every species is curated by other species, and every species is also a work of art, curated by other species. So, and from this point of view, what I'm stressing is the fact that we really have, first of all, to consider that everything in nature is artificial, because nature is just a huge amount of techniques shared by a lot of agents. And secondly, that in a way, this artificiality is every time exactly the same contingent and aesthetical or religious reasons that it has in our lives. So in a way we have really to accept what Darwin showed. So in a way, Darwin showed that we are animals. That means that our mind is a question of atoms, molecules, biological structures, and so on. But that means that mind is everywhere, because if mind is a question of atoms, then mind is really everywhere, not just in humans. And also because nowadays that once that we acknowledge that even plants are thinking, that is, that living beings do not need a brain or nervous system in order to think, then really what we call in French esprit, or Geist in German, mind or consciousness, you can call it as you want, but that is everywhere we live, and on each scale of matter, so from the atom to the sun. So, and once that you acknowledge that, then you are obliged to consider that everything is at the same time artistic, artificial, political, religious, and so on. The question is that it is difficult normally to understand the religion of other species, or the art of other species. It's difficult to understand the religion or the culture or the language of other, in a way, of other human beings. Then it's much more difficult to understand the language of, of bees or of. But we know that they have a language, so it's. The question is just it's difficult to understand them, and in a way to develop, to negotiate with them.
Starting about 370 million years ago, there was an era called the Carboniferous. And during this era, plants learnt how to form trees. Now, before this, they made cellulose, which is a simple compound, and they were making small plants, maybe, like this, mosses, whatever. And at some point, they learned how to make lignin. Lignin is a really complicated chemical, and it is really tough. People have compared it to Bakelite, the plastic that early telephones were made out of. It's essentially indestructible. And lignin is what gives plants the structural strength that allows them to grow upward and form trees. So they started to produce trees. And at that point, the US and England were pretty much joined at the hip, and they were, well, both North America and Europe were hanging out around the equator. So it was warm, and there was also more land because the oceans were lower. So it was a great place to have tremendous plant growth. And when plants started to make trees, they really went overboard. They overdid it. They were forming lignin to the extent that they were using many, many times the amount of lignin in their bark, for example, that a modern tree would have. So all of a sudden, you have this huge growth of plants. And in fact, it was so enormous that so much carbon dioxide was sequestered that the oxygen levels in the atmosphere dropped so far that there would be spontaneous fires. This is why you see, dragonflies with these tremendous wing spreads, because the partial pressure of oxygen was high enough to drive oxygen into their spiracles to a body size that's bigger than any insect today. It was a very weird period, the Carboniferous. And the reason that this just went on and on and on, with more and more trees growing and more stuff piling up in marshes and bogs and everywhere, and it just kept piling and piling and piling, is that no creatures on Earth had learned how to digest lignin. The lignin is almost impossible to digest. There's no enzyme that we can call a lignase. And the only creatures really which digest lignin today are the fungi. When we see rot fungi in wood, they are sort of digesting it. But in fact, the way they are digesting it is that they are generating hydrogen peroxide. In other words, they haven't been able to really digest it, but they've learned how to kind of explode it, how to blow it apart. But it took a long time for them to learn this trick. And until they learned it, nothing got digested. So by the time that the fungi had started to break down lignin, the trees had also, the plants had started to calm down in their production of lignin. So it was like our modern trees. So by the time that it got into sync, it was 60 to 70 million years later. And in all that time, this wood has been building up, which turned to peat, which turned to lignite, which turned to coal. And so you have coal beds in this sites of the Carboniferous that are 40 feet deep or more. This is the coal that we have, that England has. It's not an accident that the Industrial Revolution started in these places. And what happened was that we started burning all that coal. we reverse the Carboniferous. And that is why we have climate change.
The relationship with other species starts not at the moment when we are meeting other individuals coming from other species. So the multi-specific encounters takes place already in our body or in our lives, because each species is, in a way, in nature, a form of interspecific mixture or dialogue or encounters. In a way, that's the first consequence of the discovery of Darwin's discovery of the evolution of species. What does it mean that every species comes from a previous species? It means that every species, in a way, carries in itself rest or parts of other species from an anatomical point of view, from an ecological point of view, from an ecological point of view. So even if we take the human body and the human species, it's a sort of patchwork of different forms of life which are unified in a contingent, ephemeral form that, which we call human, but it's not a substance, it's just an enormous bricolage of other species. I mean, if you are taking our DNA, it's a patchwork of different forms of life. If we are taking our body, it's a patchwork of, or in a way, if we are taking each part of our body, we share each part of our body with a lot of species. We share the fact that having eyes with a million of other species, having a nose with a million of other species. That means that being human means already to have the experience of being other species. Being, not just encounter. We are already sort of riding zoos, actually. Each of us is a zoo. Each living being is a sort of multi-specific spectrum. So that's the first point, and it's important to stress it because, I mean, the question of living together with other species starts in a way or coincides with how can I live good with myself, and it's not that we have first of all to solve the question how can we live as human being, and then only after or afterwards we have to solve the question of living with other species. So the question of the a good multi-specific way of life coincides with the good monospecific way of life. So the first consequence of this idea is that the way we used to build cities is an absurdo. It's in a way the wrongest way of conceiving cities, because we used to conceive cities as in a way as a very paradoxical monocultural spaces. I mean, we used to think we used to think that states or cities are Leviathan, in the words of Hobbes, so the collection of all bodies of women and men resting on a mineral space, or a space of stones. And we are actually used to reject all other species outside the city. So that is in a way the idea from where comes the word forest, which means actually which comes from the Latin foris, which means outside of the city. So we used to consider cities, states, politics as the collection of human bodies, monocultural collection of human bodies that rejects outside itself everything which does not belong to humanity. So there is little exceptions. So a couple of trees, dogs, in the past also horses, cats, in an illegal way also rats, or a couple of insects. But in a way, cities are the first example of monoculture. And from this point of view, it's totally stupid to accuse agriculture to be the one who invented monoculture. The real monocultural culture is the city. So we have, first of all, to change or to overcome this division. And we have to change it because of very, very material reasons, because to think of life as the simple association of human and stones, in a way means to think of deserts. So in a way, cities are the first cause of desertification in the world, because when you are putting together only human beings and stones, you are producing literally deserts in a way. So, and in order to overcome that, in order to overcome this opposition between cities and forests, we have to, at the same time, reintroduce other non-human species within cities. But we have also, and that's perhaps the most important and the most difficult way, we have also to start considering forests as non-human cities. Because, of course, now architects and urbanists are producing a lot of examples of reforestation of cities. I think of Stefano Boeri's vertical forest, but there is a huge amount of attempts also of putting again agricultural space within cities and so on. But we also have to, in a way, try to change the way we consider non-urban spaces or non-human spaces, that it's the ancient forest, in the sense that we really have to consider that, or we really have to start thinking that cities are not purely human structures, and that every non-human being is producing cities or is designing spaces and so on. And that's perhaps, in order to do that, we have to reconsider two elements of the way we consider animals, plants, or bacteria and so on. First of all, we have to stop considering that human beings are the only one to have an agency. So agency is the most common thing existing in the universe. So every living being is able of taking a decision about his or her own life. So plants are thinking, bacteria are thinking, viruses are thinking. But that also means, if we are really rigorous in this, in the fact of acknowledging that other living beings are also self-conscious and able of agency, we also have to acknowledge that they are also able to make bad decisions, that in a way every other living being is able to make bad choices. And that point is perhaps the most difficult point for contemporary ecology, because actually the contemporary debate about ecological stuff or ecological problems nowadays starts from the positions that actually, except for human beings, every other living being is able to produce a paradise on Earth. So if human beings stop being human beings and stop producing Anthropocene or catastrophes and so on, the Earth would be a paradise on Earth. The Earth would be a sort of paradise where everybody is living together in a very positive way, which is totally stupid.
When I think about fungi in the future, it's very hard to differentiate them from plants, from the role of plants in the future, and really from soil. And people have pointed out that at this point, you know, at different times we've had different big unknowns, like space was a big unknown, underwater, undersea was a big unknown. But at this point in time, the biggest unknown is probably the soil that is underfoot and that we treat as if it is dirt. And it turns out that everything is dependent on soil, and soil is being attacked by a number of sort of unexpected threats. I was just reading about a really unexpected threat, which is earthworms. Here in North America, we have no native earthworms at all. And the reason is the glacier. The glacier pretty much wiped out whatever earthworms we might have had. So every earthworm that we have, and we have quite a few now, is basically, it's an invasive alien. And some are more invasive than others. And we always think of earthworms as, we think of them as the gardener's friend. They're these wonderful creatures who mix up the soil. But people who are doing research now on northern forests, especially, for example, Minnesota has done a lot of work on this. They are seeing earthworms that are eating the top layer of the forest. The top layer of a northern forest is sort of humus, or sometimes called duff. It's an easy to digest, soft layer that is really important for our ecosystems. So there's a fungal mat in there. It is the place where seedlings grow. It holds moisture for not only for native plants, but also for things like salamanders and little frogs, a variety of animals and plants. And the earthworms are eating up this layer. One set of researchers put it that they are eating the soil from the roots of seedling trees. And the trees are dying. So there is the possibility that we will lose our native plantings, many of our native trees. There's always something tough that's left, but it's not a whole ecosystem, and it's not necessarily what we would want. And it's going to be because we're seeing more and more species of earthworms that are they are moving very, very fast. So at this point, there are places in Alaska where the biomass of earthworms is greater than the biomass of moose. They are eating the part of the soil that much of our native forest and understory plants depend on. And then, of course, there's the part underneath that, which is full of it's a whole microbiome of everything you can imagine, bacteria, tiny insects, fungi. One thing I realized at one point is that every scientist who's studied the soil sees it in terms of their specialty. So I see it in terms of an incredible fungal mat. Because when you see, for example, a mushroom, I mean, the mushroom is just a transient attempt for the underground fungus to have sex. And very, very, very few fungi do this. If there are maybe 5 million species of fungi in the world, maybe 10,000 of them can create a mushroom. But underground is what we call the mycelium. It's this net of fungal threads. And that is the real fungus. And the mycelium can live forever. And it can travel incredible distances, and it can, what it does, because fungi, in terms of evolution and in terms of physiology, fungi are actually closer to animals than they are to plants. They're like us. They breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. And like us, they can't photosynthesize. They are dependent upon plants. We're all dependent upon plants for sugar, basically. So these underground fungi are forming partnerships with the roots of trees. And this is an amazing story that people are just starting to learn about. Until we could analyze DNA, we didn't know what was there. We really didn't know what was happening. But the linkage between fungi and plants is specific. Not every fungus, we call these mycorrhizal fungi because they form a tiny organ with the root of a plant that they actually enter into that's called a mycorrhiza. And the importance of this can be judged by something that was said a while ago by a biological conference meeting on this topic. And they said, basically, functionally speaking, plants don't have roots. They have mycorrhiza. And we think that when multicellular plants first came onto dry land, they came with mycorrhizal fungi. So this is one thing that's underground. And when you ask an entomologist what's underground, they'll tell you about all of the insects that are living there. And when you ask, another kind of zoologist, they'll talk about nematodes and other tiny creatures. And of course, a bacteriologist will talk about the bacteria, so that it's almost as if the soil is this living substance composed of the bodies of all of these creatures. And we're not being kind to them, and we are really, really dependent upon them. We talk about dirt. Dirt is abused soil that is dead. But if we don't have soil with this rich mix of tiny organisms, how will we live?
Every living species has actually a political relationship to the space it occupies. What does it mean? It means that we have to stop considering that there is something like native species. That's sorry for the word, but it's totally a bullshit from a scientific point of view. Actually, the idea that there would be something like a native species is a discourse which started in the 19th century. it started first of all from the botany, and then it has also been translated for zoological species. And the first one who tried to consider that there is a sort of totally natural relationship between a plant and the space was a British botanist. It's important to stress that he was British because he could, in a way, think about this sort of static relationship between a species and the land, because of the fact that he was living on an island, actually. And it has been proved that the model of the island has had a terrible influence on the ecological thinking. So, in 19th century, actually, Watson was writing a book about British flora. So the book was called The British S.E.L, and he started saying that in order to consider a plant to be authentically British, he had to distinguish plants that used to live in Britain for a lot of centuries from the plants that came to Britain or to England just for ornamental reasons or just for a couple of years. In the same way, he adds, you cannot consider British, German or French people who are coming just for touristic reasons. So, and starting from this point of view, from this point, we consider that there are some plants which are native or indigenous, autochthonous, and plants which are not autochthonous. And what he did was actually to apply categories from the common law. So he literally took the categories of citizenship that the common law in the 19th century used to use in order to classify populations. So citizen, denizen, alien, and so on. And he applied this kind of categories to plants. So it was a sort of counter-totemist or anti-totemist operations, which is totally ridiculous because in a way he was asking plants to behave like good British citizens, which is totally, and each time that we are trying, or each time that we are speaking about a plant or an animal has autochthonous or has indigenous, we are asking again plants or animals to behave like good human beings of the 19th century, because the paradox is that in that time to travel was much more difficult than nowadays. So that's the first point. So the first point is to realize that the idea of an indigenous species is a projection of human categories on non-human living beings. The second point is that from a biological point of view, the relationship of a plant or of an animal or of a living being to the land, to the piece of soil it occupies, it is never natural and is never eternal. First of all, for instance, each tree, which is in a way the paradigmatic idea of, or the Platonic idea of sort of static living being, is obliged normally to throw away its children from itself in order to avoid, in a way, competition. So each tree, so the most static and the most non-dynamic living being on Earth actually is a migrant starting from the beginning. So, and other living beings are also, in a way, if trees are migrants, what should we think about lions or bacteria or viruses which normally travel for thousands of kilometers through winds or through other animals and so on. So in a way, life is always a migrant force. Also because, and we never consider that from a geological point of view, in a way, land is also a migrant stuff. So in a way, because of the tectonic of plates, so every continent is a sort of boat which is traveling around on the sphere, which is the Earth. So there is, in a way, only migrants, and there is only, in a way, a negotiation about on which boat should we live.
You know, what Suzanne Simard discovered was that it's not just that the fungi are making mycorrhizal connections with the roots of trees, it's that they are joining trees together. And they are joining trees together in ways that can encompass an entire forest. And there's a lot of communication going on within this web, which is called, it's called the Wood Wide Web, and that name was given to it by some unsung editor of Nature, the journal, when Suzanne Simard's article first appeared in it, and that name has stuck. Other people have tried to call it the Internet of the Forest, but Wood Wide Web is a great name. And when she first came out with this finding, people really didn't want to believe it. And the part of it that they really didn't want to believe was that it was a socialist system, that the trees that had gotten access to capital, and for a green plant, we'll say that one form of capital is sunlight. So there are trees up at the canopy, and they have access to capital, and they are making sugar, and they're sending a tremendous percent of the sugar down to their roots. I mean, close to half in many cases. And they are sharing it with the fungi. But the fungi are then sharing it with other trees, and they're sharing it with trees that are not able to get up to the canopy and access as much sunlight. So there was a lot of resistance to the idea of this socialism in the forest. And then people decided, well, if they're sharing it with their own seedlings, it's okay. But then more research showed that they're actually sharing it with not just their own seedlings, but different species of trees in the forest. And the other thing is that they're sharing it with some plants that are basically parasitic. They're plants that don't photosynthesize. An example in our local forests here in the Northeast is something called Indian pipe. These plants are called monotropes, and they are being fed by the fungal web, which is sneaking them some sugar from the trees. And of course, the fungi are also taking the sugars, and they in turn are feeding the plants. They're giving them they're giving them phosphorus, they're giving them nitrogen, they're giving them water, because the fungal net, this very tiny, thin filaments that fungi send out can travel much further and get into places that plant roots can't. And the other thing is that plants can't do, I mean, they can make sugar, but they cannot do all the things that the fungi can do. For example, the fungi can free up phosphorus from the minerals that it's bound to. They can do this by extruding acids. And they can also, they can rot the duff of the forest floors. But the other thing that we're learning about fungi is how many of them are carnivorous. And that's really interesting that, for example, there's a little fungus that affiliates especially with pine trees in the forest that I know. And it was the very first fungus to have its DNA completely sequenced. And through a series of experiments, a scientist in British Columbia named John Chloronymus noticed that the hyphae, the threads of this particular fungus were not being eaten by little tiny insects called springtails that eat the hyphae of other fungi. And when he looked at the analysis of the DNA, he noticed that a section of it was very similar to snake venom. And it turned out that this particular little fungus is killing these tiny insects called springtails, which exist by the billions, and feeding some of that nitrogen to its trees. So, I mean, the trees basically are getting the NPK that gardeners feed plants in the garden from their fungal partners. And this partnership is very flexible and very labile. So as long as the tree needs nitrogen and phosphorus, it will keep the fungal partners that can do this for them. And a tree may have 100 different fungal partners or more. And each of those may be doing something different for the tree. But if, for example, the tree starts to get nitrogen or phosphorus from, say, acid rain or runoff, or because somebody has thought that fertilizer was a good idea for the forest, the tree will just get rid of those fungal partners. The tree knows what it's getting from all of its potentially thousands of fungal partners. And if it stops getting what it needs, it will simply stop giving that partner sugar. And it's amazing we're learning how intelligent plants are. So there was a book recently that was called, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? Of course we're not. And there should be another book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Plants Are? And a lot of botanists are starting to work on this and to understand that plants are so responsive and they don't have a nervous system or a brain that we know of, but when we look at them, it's as if they do.
Realizing that every living species is coming from elsewhere should help us also to stop quarreling about very stupid stuff, like also in gastronomic debates about food which is coming from the real authentic land and so on. I mean, I'm coming from Italy, and if you are looking at the typical Italian plate, which is pasta al ragù, there is nothing typically Italian, because pasta is made out of wheat, which is coming from Middle Orient, and tomatoes are American, are not Italian at all. So it's sort of every food is in a way multicultural and in a way globalized. There is no such a thing like typical. Of course, then we have to in a way to avoid homogenization, but there is nothing like a typical food or typical identity. There is no identity. It's impossible to produce a static identity in relationship to a space, because of the fact that every relationship to a space is political. So every relationship to the space is produced by a negotiation by different species. And from this point of view, we have to start to realize that, for instance, what we call biome, or what we normally consider as a natural association of some species on a specific piece of land of territory, is not natural at all. It's also, as France, as Germany, the result of previous negotiation by different species who started living in a space and who also modified the space in order to make their own life possible. Because the other point that we have, or the other consequence of the fact that we have to consider that every natural space is a political space, so every forest is a city, is that we have to realize that every species is modifying in a very strong way the space it occupies. So, for instance, we now know, for instance, that the Amazonian forest is producing by itself the rains that it needs. So it's not that the trees on the Amazonian forest are there because of the fact that from a climatic point of view, there is a lot of water and there is a lot of rains. No, it's exactly the opposite. Because of the existence of those trees on this area, there is a lot of rain. So that is just one of the billion examples of the fact that every living being is not just adapting itself to its environment. It's actually normally the opposite. Every living being is actually modifying the environment in order to make its own life possible. So exactly like us. So we are in a space like also this house, and we have to arrange the space in order to make our life possible. And we are particularly, in a way, skilled in order to modify the space in order to live. But every living species is actually modifying the space which is surrounding it in order to live better. So every living species is a sort of designer of the world, or architects of the world. And so from this point of view, architecture is not just a human business, it's the business of every living being, starting from the bacteria, actually, starting from the viruses, which are actually, the life of a virus is actually the design of different living beings, so the active redesign of different living beings in order to make its own life possible. So design and architecture are everywhere.
There's one thing I wanted to say, which is that one prominent biologist once said that he would be willing to eat the last panda on Earth if it would save the microbial community, if it would draw people's attention to the microbes. Because when organizations try to save an ecosystem, they go for an iconic, what we call the iconic megafauna, because you can't tell people to save bacteria. You can't tell them to save fungi or tiny microscopic worms. But we all hope that maybe if people save the elephants, if they save the panda, if they save the grizzly bear, the wolf, that maybe the microbial communities will also be saved.
So I want to bring a planetary perspective to this question of living together. And by planetary, I don't mean global. I mean Earth as opposed to Mars or some other world. And I don't just mean humans. I mean all life forms here today. The essential thing to realize is that over the course of its long history, Earth has been transformed almost beyond imagining, and much of that transformation is due to the activities of organisms that lived and died ages ago. And just to give an example, for the first half of Earth history, the air had no oxygen to speak of. All of the oxygen atoms were tied up in the water and the rocks. And it was not until the evolution of a group of life forms called the cyanobacteria that began to change. All of the oxygen that you inhale with every breath, that keeps you going, that allows you to think and live, all of that has been put here by the activities of living organisms. Or to give another example, think about mountain ranges. This seems something very far removed from life, but nevertheless, mountain ranges here are influenced by the activities of life. So animals like corals, they build enormous limestone structures. You could think of the Great Barrier Reef, which today runs 2,300 kilometers along the coast of Australia. So it's vast. And although animals, and particularly corals, have not been around for all that long meaning not more than a few 100 million years, life forms of some sort have been building limestone structures for many billions of years. And the thing about limestone is that it's a very malleable rock, as rocks go. And so the presence of large amounts of limestone in areas where the earth begins to upheave mountains will change the way that those mountains fold. And so even organisms, something that seems so far removed from life is nevertheless influenced by it. And thinking about life on Earth this way has changed the way that I see the world. It's changed what I think it means to be alive. It gives me a sense of connection with the water, the rocks, the air, as well as with all other living beings. And I find it very moving to think that the planet that we experience today is to a very large extent the product of the activities of other life forms. I find it beautiful. It's also changed the way that I think about Mars. As you probably know, Mars today is the focus of escape fantasies of a group of people who don't want to live together. It's the idea that a small band of chosen people will take a long journey. They will leave this tainted world and they will take a long journey in a kind of purgatory, and they will arrive at a new Eden. But have you ever really looked at Mars? Have you lined up Mars and the Earth next to each other and really looked at them? Mars is unbelievably inhospitable. For a human to survive there, even for a moment or two, you have to be within a small shell of the Earth. You have to wear a spacesuit that allows you to have some kind of earthly environment with you. The Martian temperatures are freezing cold. Radiation pours off the sun. It's not blocked out from the Martian atmosphere by ozone the way that it is here, because ozone is itself a product of the activities of life. And besides, it's just a vista of bare rock. Now, it hasn't always been as inhospitable as it is today. It seems that 3.5 billion years ago or so, Mars had water. It might even have had oceans, and it's possible that life of some kind emerged there. It's even possible that life of some kind lives there still, somewhere deep beneath that rusty, dusty, lethal surface. After all, there are some organisms that live very deep within the Earth. Perhaps there are organisms that live very deep within Mars. And don't get me wrong, it would be incredibly exciting to find life forms of Mars. It would allow us to answer some of the greatest scientific questions of all time. It would have metaphysical implications for how we understand ourselves. But we don't need to go to Mars to know that whatever has happened there is fundamentally different from what has happened here. If there is anything living within Mars, it is limited and sparse. Earth, in contrast, screams, alive! Now, this has some bearing on the whole question of what an Earth-like planet is. People like to talk about the search for Earth-like planets, Earth 2.0. And if all you mean by that is a wet, rocky planet not very far from a star, there are probably countless billions. But if you mean a planet that is comfortable for humans, there may only be one. This one. After all, Earth itself has not been comfortable for humans for most of its history. If you had a time machine and were to travel back into the past, you would very quickly arrive at a point where you too needed a spacesuit just as surely as if you were going to Mars or the moon. Earth feels perfect for us because we have evolved with it. But all of the indications are that human activities are changing the planet in such a way that it may not remain perfect for us for all that much longer. The study of life and Earth has convinced me that the Anthropocene is real. Humans are exerting fundamental changes on the life-Earth system. We are not the first life forms to have effected large changes, but humans are effecting these changes faster and far more of them all at once. The changes that humans are causing are unprecedented in their scope and unprecedented in their speed. This is terrifying, but it is also an opportunity, because as far as we know, humans are the only life form that has ever been able to reflect on the impacts that we are having. And that means we have a choice. We can choose to continue as we are, which will be disruptive not only for ourselves, but for every other life form here. And as far as we know, this is the only planet in the whole cosmos that has such diversity and richness of forms. Or we can change.
Good afternoon again. Thank you for...
Rieccoci e grazie per aver partecipato alla prima parte dell'incontro di oggi, ovvero la terza parte del film How Will We Live Together, prodotto dalla Sensory Ethnography Lab. Avete visto prima sullo schermo Emanuele Coccia, che ha presentato il suo punto di vista su come vivremo insieme, concentrandosi in particolare sulla vita nelle città. Avremo una conversazione con lui su Zoom. Emanuele, è un piacere vederti. Dove ti trovi, Emanuele, al momento?
Today I'm in Paris now. I was in the south of France yesterday, but now I'm in Paris.
In Francia l'interprete si scusa, ma l'audio è pessimo. Vorrei chiederti, Emanuele, prima di farlo però, dato che sei presente, hai visto il film è un dialogo tra te e gli altri pensatori su quest'idea. Se hai delle risposte dopo aver sentito quello che hanno detto gli altri relatori. Prima di tutto vorrei ringraziarvi per avermi permesso di ascoltare il film. Prima di tutto è importante il concetto di spazio.
In the context of the architecture biennial, and we are speaking about architectural
parliamo della storia dell'architettura, la cosa interessante è che tutti quelli che hanno parlato nelle prime due parti del film sostengono che è lo spazio che va considerato come qualcosa da adattare, usare, immaginare da parte degli architetti, ed era soltanto una parte limitata dello spazio enorme del mondo. Dobbiamo cambiare l'idea di suolo, quello che diceva Susan all'inizio. Il suolo non è soltanto questa estensione geometrica di spazio. Il suolo è molto di più, è un grattacielo con abitanti livelli che già sono presenti ai vari livelli. E questa cambierebbe già radicalmente la rappresentazione di ciò che gli architetti utilizzano o di ciò che gli architetti rappresentano, di ciò che gli architetti cambiano. Perché ogni volta che costruiamo case, edifici, in un certo senso non soltanto modifichiamo lo spazio superiore, dobbiamo pensare che il suolo è già abitato e quindi dovremmo in un certo senso negoziare con chi già lo abita. E altre parti dello spazio vanno considerate allo stesso modo, perché anche l'aria, l'atmosfera è già uno spazio abitato, la luce, l'acqua. In questo film siamo costretti a considerare che lo spazio è molto più ampio di quello che pensiamo, ma è anche molto più diverso di quello che pensiamo. Dovremmo forse abbandonare la nostra idea che noi siamo centrali per l'architettura nella modernità, ovvero lo spazio in senso geometrico cartesiano. Non esiste lo spazio perché tutto sulla Terra è pieno di esseri viventi. Non c'è uno spazio oggettivo perché tutto è pieno di soggetti, quindi da questo punto di vista questo film è un invito a inventare un'architettura diversa, animista, in cui non c'è più spazio soggettivo-oggettivo. Ma come diceva Bruno Latour all'inizio, prima di chiederci come possiamo vivere insieme, dovremmo chiederci quanti siamo noi esseri viventi. E questo diventa forse, secondo me, la domanda più urgente, più importante per l'architettura. E il secondo punto a cui pensavo guardando il film è che forse l'architettura dovrebbe abbandonare l'idea di città. La città, come posso dire, è un concetto che dovremmo smettere di usare, perché non ha senso. Se lo spazio comprende il suolo, l'aria, l'acqua, e se ovunque ci sono già esseri viventi, ci sono già abitanti, tra virgolette, allora il concetto di città non ha più senso. Perché in un certo senso la prominenza dell'idea di città, quello che cercavo di dire è che la città è quest'illusione che ci sia uno spazio nel mondo che appartiene a noi umanità, tra virgolette, che è falso. Questi sono i due punti, secondo me, che in un certo senso ho sviluppato ascoltando il film. Un manifesto per un nuovo tipo di architettura, senza oggetti, con oggetti nuovi, idee nuove, il che mi porta alla prima domanda che volevo farti. In un certo senso, Emanuele, hai lavorato con le piante, con le case, più di recente con i musei, mettendo in dubbio i concetti base su cos'è lo spazio, la nozione dell'oggetto e che cos'è, quali sono i confini di un oggetto. E poi questa questione dell'identità che hai affrontato attraverso la botanica. Anche se non sempre parli di architettura direttamente e la sua capacità d'agire, ci sono delle implicazioni importantissime sull'architettura attraverso le tue teorie, che ci portano a ripensare l'architettura e la sua capacità di agire. E ti vorrei mostrare 3 esempi che sono emersi dalla tua presentazione di oggi. Il primo è l'idea della foresta rispetto alla città. E hai dimostrato con il tuo lavoro che l'architettura è sempre stata collegata all'idea di città, la città e il suo contesto, e quindi la foresta è estranea alla città. È fuori non solo dalla città, ma fuori quindi anche dall'architettura. E se dobbiamo ripensare a che tipo di architettura potrebbe riportare la foresta all'interno, quale sia l'architettura che possa costruire un ponte tra la città e la foresta, quale dovrebbe essere? In Biennale ci sono 5 sezioni, 5 scale, e la sezione Across Borders, ci sono dei progetti che seguono questa linea di pensiero, e anche nella sezione Households si comincia a pensare a altre dimensioni, il suolo, l'atmosfera. Quindi stiamo cominciando a esplorare questo tipo di idea. Ma questo significa abbandonare tanti preconcetti sull'architettura. Foresta e città sono un'unica dimensione. La seconda cosa è che tu hai sottolineato l'idea di mobilità nella tua presentazione. Quest'idea che l'architettura o che le specie debbano essere radicate, native, indigene, va messa in discussione. L'architettura ha sempre è sempre stata pesata per le sue responsabilità. L'architettura è luogo, non solo spazio. Deve essere radicata nel suo spazio, ma deve esprimere un luogo, renderlo anche più autentico, più reale, più sul luogo. Ecco, l'architettura deve liberarsi di questo peso, ma come può cominciare a rispondere allo spazio? E la terza considerazione che tu hai sollevato è l'idea di oggetti o umani o entità che sono un patchwork, che sono un insieme di entità diverse, che appartengono a gruppi diversi. Sono una mescolanza di origini diverse e che hanno creato l'oggetto che noi vediamo. E l'architettura è ossessionata dal proprio Gestalt, on Gestalt, e si deve liberare da questo concetto. Sono 3 dimensioni importanti che sono emerse dal tuo discorso e che sicuramente hanno un effetto su di noi, quindi non puoi buttare lì 3 idee e poi mollarci da soli, devi elaborare su questo. Non so se sono in grado di rispondere in così poco tempo, servirebbero 3 giorni, 3 mesi forse. Partendo dalla prima idea della foresta, della relazione tra foresta e città, è vero che c'è questa opposizione tra foresta e città, ma nell'ultimo mese ho pensato anche che se seguiamo come dire, la narrativa degli antropologi su come le città siano nate, sappiamo che in realtà abbiamo cominciato a costruire le città per l'agricoltura, per i giardini. I primi gruppi umani sono arrivati all'idea di costruire città quando hanno deciso di abbandonare la loro forma di vita di cacciatori, nomadi, e si sono trasformati invece in un gruppo che voleva avere un legame temporale con un insieme di piante, di alberi che avrebbero potuto dar loro cibo. e che è interessante dal punto di vista architettonico, perché dimostra che gli orti, i giardini non sono un creazione secondaria delle città, ma sono arrivati con l'inizio della città stessa. È stato proprio per i giardini, per le orti che abbiamo costruito le città con raccolte di abitazioni fisse, ed è interessante perché se consideriamo questo punto di vista potremmo trovare un nuovo modo di mettere insieme le città e le foreste, ma è interessante anche perché ci dà un nuovo punto di vista sul fatto che le città sono nate all'inizio come entità interspecifiche. Se prendiamo seriamente l'idea che le città sono nate per dei gruppi di umani che avevano deciso di sviluppare l'agricoltura, di vivere vicino a piante, alberi, organismi vegetali, questo significa che le città all'inizio sono un'associazione di persone che vengono da ambienti diversi e dobbiamo ritornare a quest'idea originale della città come associazione di specie diverse che vengono da reami diversi, da regni diversi. E bisogna riesumare l'idea del XIX secolo dell'uomo e della città che crea i giardini. È un secondo modo di rispondere alla tua domanda. Quello che chiamiamo antropocene, in realtà, come dire, è l'antropocene significa che non ci sono più luoghi sul pianeta che non subisca la presenza dell'essere umano. Ogni parte della Terra è stata compresa nella nostra idea di casa. Antropocene significa che la nostra casa si è ampliata così tanto che a questo punto coincide con il pianeta stesso. E da una parte è una cosa tragica, dall'altra è anche interessante perché significa che adesso siamo nelle nostre case insieme a tante altre persone che non appartengono tanti altri esseri che non appartengono alla nostra specie. Significa che le nostre case sono state invase da altre specie. La domanda della Biennale di Venezia, in un certo senso, non è neanche più una domanda politica, è una domanda domestica, proprio per l'antropocene. Dentro alle nostre case non ci sono più solo i topi o gli insetti, ci sono tutti gli altri esseri viventi e dobbiamo in qualche modo adeguarci a loro. È un'idea interessante, messa in questo modo, credo sia un modo interessante di ripensare all'architettura come una coabitazione animistica in luoghi comuni, condivisi. È un'idea di spazio, una serie di rituali di come vivere insieme, di come stare nello stesso spazio, piuttosto che come costruire forme, eccetera. Questa può essere forse la risposta alla tua prima domanda. E poi ti do tempo di rispondere e poi cercherò di rispondere agli altri due punti che hai sottolineato. In un certo senso, Emanuele, hai già risposto anche alle altre due domande, ma se posso concentrarmi sulla nozione di mobilità, perché è estremamente importante. Uno degli intervistati, Steven Greenblatt, nel suo libro Culture and Mobility, utilizza il concetto di cultura come problematico per una serie di idee che ha dentro di sé. La cultura dovrebbe essere omogenea e non contaminata, ha un esterno e un interno e niente in mezzo, e l'altra dimensione è che non è mobile, non cambia, non si muove. Ma tu invece ci dai un punto di vista diverso dalla vita delle piante, che ci permette di cominciare a immaginare che le varie categorie che abbiamo applicato per gli umani possiamo trasferirle alle piante. Se invece guardiamo le piante non si comportano in quel modo, e anche l'architettura si basa sulle stesse categorie. Quando parliamo delle case, ci sono le tipologie di case che sono collegate a forme di vita che sono radicate nella geografia, nei luoghi. Queste sono le categorie con cui lavoriamo in architettura e ci troviamo bene con questo. Gli stati-nazione si basano sull'immagine di architettura che è autentica, così come si basa su paesaggi autentici. E tu ce lo vuoi togliere? Che cosa possiamo fare? Come dobbiamo comportarci? È una domanda difficile, nel senso che quest'idea di identità prodotta dal fatto che si è radicati su un suolo, in un certo senso si può essere pensata come astrologia inversa. C'è questa astrologia babilonese che dice che l'identità è legata alla posizione dei pianeti al momento in cui sei nato. E questa astrologia nazionale è l'idea che la tua identità sia definita dalla posizione, dalla relazione tra il tuo corpo con altri corpi celesti, la Terra in questo caso, perché dimentichiamo che la Terra fa parte del cielo, non è un'entità a sé, e costruiamo questa nuova astrologia e noi siamo alla ricerca di questa superstizione astrologica e non consideriamo la vera astrologia, che però deriva dalla stessa origine epistemologica. Anch'essa è una superstizione. Nel mio caso, per esempio, dovrei essere italiano, anche se ho trascorso la maggior parte della mia vita fuori dall'Italia, ed è la stessa idea che, essendo nato il 6 giugno, sono gemelli, anche se ho avuto esperienze che hanno cambiato la mia vita in modo drastico. Questa chiaramente è una battuta, ma cercando di darti una risposta più seria, direi che dovremmo forse cercare di smettere di pensare che viviamo sul terreno. Anche nel pensiero ecologico c'è questo tentativo di affrontare Gaia, la Terra, in modo feticistico. E dimentichiamo che non abitiamo soltanto il terreno, abitiamo anche il cielo. Certo, mettiamo i piedi per terra, sul terreno, ma lo spazio più importante che occupiamo sono le parti dell'atmosfera, del cielo, che confondiamo con la Terra, ma che non appartiene alla Terra però. Tutto lo spazio è cielo. E se prendiamo questo punto di vista, abbiamo sviluppato una scienza che si occupa di ciò che accade nel cielo, che si chiama meteorologia, che è una scienza molto interessante. Perché? Perché è una scienza complessa, ma è anche una scienza in cui non cerchiamo di comandare cosa accade, cerchiamo soltanto di evitare i pericoli. Ma lasciamo che ciò che accade nel cielo diventi una parte della storia. Accettiamo quello che ci propone la meteorologia. In questa parte del mondo le entità sono libere di fare quello che vogliono. Nella parte meteorologica del mondo i pianeti, le nuvole hanno diritto di muoversi. Una delle idee dovrebbe essere, secondo me, considerare la meteorologia come la scienza basica per l'architettura, o meglio, avere uno sguardo meteorologico anche sulla Terra. Perché ogni volta che guardiamo i fenomeni sulla Terra, sul terreno, cerchiamo di governarli, di influenzarli. Quando parliamo di ecosistemi, stiamo semplicemente cercando, in un certo senso, di sistemare in qualche modo una coabitazione tra esseri viventi diversi che appartengono a regni diversi, che è il modello dell'equilibrio. Ma non crediamo mai al cielo di produrre un equilibrio. Quindi dovremmo applicare il nostro punto di vista meteorologico alla Terra e accettare alla fine che anche noi siamo entità meteorologiche. Quando è stato in America Latina, Alexander von Humboldt usava il cianoscopio che utilizzava per misurare il blu del cielo, 53 tonalità di blu, per identificare non soltanto le piante, gli animali del luogo, ma il tipo di blu che aveva quel luogo. Questo per spiegare fino a che punto c'era questa volontà di controllo, ed è liberatorio invece che se anche definisci l'identità di un luogo, sia un grado di blu, sia una definizione meteorologica, una sfumatura di un'entità universale. Anche l'architettura dovrebbe forse essere misurata come un grado di blu piuttosto che un oggetto con le radici sul terreno. Sì, una metafora bellissima, l'architettura ha un grado di colore. Un'ultima domanda. Non tanto su quanto hai detto oggi, ma piuttosto sul tuo nuovo libro, La filosofia della casa, The Philosophy of the House. Hai esplorato una dimensione della casa che è diversa, quella dell'amore. La Biennale ha un'intera sezione dedicata alla casa. Se si passa dalla scala del corpo alla scala del mondo, ci sono una serie di scale emotive associate a ciascuna sezione. Se si parla di Among Diverse Beings, c'è un tentativo di creare empatia. Se si passa alla scala della household, della casa, della comunità, dell'unità familiare, ci sono altre emozioni. E se si passa alla scala dell'universo si cerca questa comunità universale. Nel tuo nuovo libro fai una distinzione netta tra la scala della casa e la scala della città. Come architetto mi occupo di città e di ordine e associazioni. Una città, come ci dicono alcuni etnografi, è quando due case condividono un muro, quando l'amore si espande da una casa a un'altra casa. Perché per te è importante distinguere tra città e casa? E un'altra dimensione della domanda è: quando due case condividono un muro, condividono di più. Una nuova demografia del mondo ci fa pensare che all'interno di un'unità immobiliare soltanto il 30% delle case sono unità familiari nel senso tradizionale. Ci sono forme di amore che si estendono al di là della casa. Grazie. Prima di tutto Una premessa breve sul fatto che è importante parlare di questo tipo di amore anche nella coabitazione tra specie diverse, perché ho sempre pensato, una volta che si addomestica un animale, se si vive con un cane, con un gatto, la cosa interessante è che questa coabitazione è che si condivide la stessa casa con un individuo che appartiene a una specie diversa, e questo produce una relazione in cui non si pensa più che questo cane appartiene a un'altra specie. C'è un tipo di vita che emerge in cui non c'è più differenziazione tra le specie. Lo si considera come un individuo senza tenere in conto della specie a cui appartiene. Ed è una cosa fondamentale anche per il modo in cui l'affronta la Biennale. Come possiamo vivere insieme è una domanda che dovremmo definire anche in ecologia. La domanda non sarà più vivere in un mondo con specie diverse, vivere in un mondo piuttosto in cui l'identità di specie sparisca, in cui non si pensi più a che specie apparteniamo. Per quanto riguarda la questione di casa e città, ho fatto questa opposizione per motivi storici. Prima di tutto perché quello che noi definiamo modernità potrebbe essere descritto come il punto in cui la città si è costruita contro lo spazio domestico, considerando la produzione di ricchezza. La modernità comincia quando il lavoro appare, quando la produzione della ricchezza non era più una questione domestica, non avveniva più all'interno delle case, nell'oikos, ma diventava invece un problema pubblico, un problema politico. Ed ecco perché le città moderne sono cambiate. E adesso stiamo assistendo un'inversione di questo processo. Il lavoro sta tornando di nuovo all'interno dell'ambiente domestico e la casa di nuovo ha la sua vendetta in un certo senso, in vari modi. Prima di tutto abbiamo appena sperimentato durante il lockdown della pandemia. Il lockdown è stata un'esperienza interessante prima di tutto perché è stata la prima volta nella storia dell'uomo che praticamente l'umanità intera ha affrontato la stessa esperienza morale, che è straordinario se ci pensiamo. Abbiamo avuto tutti la stessa esperienza, e questa esperienza è il fatto che non potevamo più utilizzare le città. Eravamo obbligati a vivere nelle case ed eravamo obbligati a riportare in casa quello che prima invece sperimentavamo nello spazio urbano, che è stato difficile, ma che è stato reso possibile grazie a questo, grazie a questa strana struttura che abbiamo costruito noi, che è una struttura interessante perché dimentichiamo che i social media sono spazi digitali prodotti da un immaginario domestico. Sono come dei salotti che ci permettono, Instagram, che è uno spazio pubblico, o WhatsApp, è una specie di salotto che ci permette di convivere con 10-15 persone con cui mi scrivo ogni giorno. E in un certo senso, attraverso questi gruppi, abbiamo costruito delle case più grandi, abbiamo rivoluzionato lo spazio domestico, nel senso che viviamo insieme con persone che non hanno niente a che fare con la nostra famiglia, e abbiamo già liberato in un certo senso lo spazio domestico dalla famiglia genealogica che era tipica dell'immaginario del XIX secolo. Viviamo un'opposizione schizofrenica tra le case minerali, per così dire, che sono ancora costruite su questo modello di XIX secolo, XVIII secolo, famiglia del XIX-XVIII secolo, e queste case digitali, queste abitazioni digitali che già stiamo sperimentando con un nuovo modo di essere, tra virgolette, a casa. Anche adesso cosa stiamo facendo? Stiamo facendo quello che potremmo fare normalmente fuori da casa, nelle città, lo stiamo facendo da casa. E questo significa che adesso la mia casa è più grande, è più ampia di quanto fosse prima, e stiamo vivendo insieme. Adesso voi siete con me nella mia biblioteca, viviamo insieme in questo spazio digitale. Ecco perché penso che le case, i nostri spazi domestici stiano cambiando la loro forma, si stanno portando dietro tante caratteristiche che nel passato appartenevano alle città, ed ecco perché dobbiamo ripensare gli spazi domestici, perché proprio come tu dicevi, viviamo in spazi domestici in cui le famiglie non sono più l'entità egemonica, dobbiamo adattare la forma architettonica degli spazi domestici a questo nuovo modo di vivere, a queste nuove esigenze degli spazi domestici che sono più grandi, molto più pubblici di quanto fossero prima. Una breve conclusione: questo tipo di esperienza diversa, questo equilibrio diverso di relazione tra spazio domestico e città, spazio pubblico, spazio privato, non è soltanto una questione tecnologica, è qualcosa di molto più profondo, che è testimonianza di una grande rivoluzione nell'idea stessa di politica. L'idea moderna di politica è l'idea che le città, gli spazi pubblici, sono una sostanza ontologicamente diversa dallo spazio domestico. Le nazioni sono in opposizione allo spazio domestico, la politica deve essere diversa dall'economia, il comune non è l'individuale, e adesso invece stiamo sperimentando dagli anni 70 in poi un modo diverso di vedere le cose, l'operaismo in Italia, l'idea che il comune, la politica non è sostanzialmente diversa dalla vita, della molteplicità degli individui, ma è una produzione di un gruppo di individui. E quello che chiamiamo platform economy è proprio quello, il modo in cui Uber, Airbnb sono strutture basate sul fatto che si può produrre comunità. In quei casi questi spazi comuni ancora una volta sono messi al servizio di un individuo, ma abbiamo inventato quest'idea così diversa di spazio comune prodotto dagli individui. E la cosa più evidente, simbolica, l'espressione più simbolica di questa rivoluzione è Airbnb. Se lo si guarda non dal punto di vista economico, dal punto di vista ma se lo si guarda dal punto di vista simbolico, Airbnb è qualcosa che produce l'identità, la coincidenza tra la sfera privata e la sfera pubblica, la casa, lo spazio domestico, l'anterior bourgeois del XX secolo diventa qualcosa di diverso in cui chiunque può entrare, ed è questa coincidenza, questo coincidere a cui dobbiamo pensare, secondo me, per i prossimi decenni. Se stiamo prendendo a prestito il nostro spazio, che sia Airbnb o lo spazio che io vedo dietro di te o lo spazio che tu vedi dietro di me. Non voglio rubarti ancora tempo, voglio però suggerire che negli ultimi minuti apriamo la possibilità al pubblico di fare domande. Non so se qualcuno abbia domande qui in questa stanza. Purtroppo non possiamo aprire le domande al pubblico online. C'è un microfono qui per le persone presenti. che possono sfruttare la presenza di Emanuele e fargli una domanda, e se no lo lasciamo tornare al suo spazio domestico. Non vedo mani, non vedo domande. Emanuele, ti amiamo e ti ringraziamo per essere stato con noi e per aver aiutato la Biennale in così tanti modi. Grazie. Grazie a voi. Grazie di essere stati qui. Vi ricordo che domani pomeriggio ci sarà un altro panel sul concetto di gioco che incrocia la Biennale in molti luoghi, da Forte Marghera al padiglione dedicato allo sport. Spero di vedervi domani per un ulteriore incontro di discussione.